On today's show, we answer your mailbag questions. We've got questions about some drafted prospects on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. And Heidi Kalakash, QMJHL and Crossover Scout for Elite Prospects, with Sebastian High, USHL and Crossover Scout for Elite Prospects. And on today's show, we'll be breaking down your mailbag questions. You guys sent in questions on Twitter, on YouTube, wherever we sent our messages out there, and we've got a bunch of questions to answer. So we're gonna have to do a two-parter. Today, we're going to be focusing on drafted prospects. So we have questions about the Habs prospects, the Hawks prospects, and a couple others sprinkled in there in the first, second, and third segment. And we'll get into those in depth, answer all your questions you have about your team's prospects there. Before we get into any of that, though, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. If you're watching on YouTube, as usual, remember to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments what you think of the episode and what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please leave us a rating review and make sure to make us your first listen of the day. So let's get started right away here with our first questions, which will be focused a bit more on the Hawks prospects here. We have a question from Hawks Hockey, very fitting name there, asking us, despite a less impressive offensive production from a guy like Oliver Moore, how would you say the pick at 19 on Oliver Moore stacks up versus other players who are available, like Gabe Perreault or Quentin Musty or etc.? Do you share the same belief that he can become a 2C in the NHL, or do you believe more 3C? I'll let you take the ring on that question first and foremost, just so we can get started here. What's your thoughts on Oliver Moore's selection at 19, and what's his upside like right now?
I was a massive fan of the pick at the time. Oliver Moore was the player I had ranked highest of those three players, and have always been really appreciative of how he approaches the game, the defensive work rate, the elite level skating, as the commenter mentions there. I think that, like, with hindsight, you probably would go with either Perreault or Musty over Oliver Moore with how they've trended since draft day, purely in terms of offensive punch. That said, I think that Oliver Moore is a great fit in the Hawks system, and they need a player like him, a player who can bring speed while also bring defensive responsibility, and a player that can play down the middle very comfortably, but can also be shifted to the wing when need be. This is a player that could also fit very nicely alongside Connor Bedard in terms of how they play stylistically. I think that'd be a really good match. And it's really quite a luxury to have in that system, that they have Bedard and Nazar and Moore and Boisvert as really, really solid centermen. And not all of them are going to be playing down the middle. Like, they are probably too good, all of them, obviously Bedard, to be playing down the lineup, down the middle, and rather be shifted to the wing, perhaps. So I could easily see Moore playing like in a top six capacity on the wing. If he does stick at center, I think 3C is probably where he sticks. But again, this is a 19-year-old player. He's very young. He's off to a good start to the season with the University of Minnesota with 5 points through 4 games. And he really picked up his production last season. He had a really slow start in production, but at a post-World Junior Championships, he was lights out and really, really driving the bus offensively for Minnesota. But for the next Hawks question here, we're looking more along the lines of like Nick Lardis, for instance, another player picked in that same 2023 draft class. And the question is, what does Nick Lardis have to add to his game to get a camp invite for the World Junior Championship? How likely is it that Spellacy could even carve out a fourth line role for Team USA?
It's a very interesting question. I think that Lardis, the main issue has always been size, right? Like, he's not the biggest player. Doesn't play big either. Very kind of peripheral playmaker with some really good goal scoring tools when it gets open in the middle of the ice. But the issue is getting open more frequently in the middle of the ice, right? Like, he's going to need to add a couple steps of off puck movement, of rotations in the offensive zone in order to be as effective as he can be in that World Juniors roster. I think he could get an invite, but he's kind of on the outside looking in right now in terms of the prospects that are kind of in that conversation. Overall, there are some questions around, obviously if you're playing in the bottom six role. Canada likes its size in the bottom six. It's very rare that they don't that they go for smaller players unless they're absolutely phenomenal. And I mean, we can just take the example of Jagger Firkus last year, who didn't make the initial cut and only got invited in once an injury occurred. He was good enough to play in their top six, but they had a really stacked top six, so he ended up playing. He ended up not being invited because his fit in the bottom six isn't as ideal, right?
Absolutely. It's also one of the reasons that I think that AJ Spellacy could carve out a role on Team USA. Obviously, USA Hockey always has a real aversion to bringing players that are based in Canada. Like we saw that with the lack of Quentin Musty in the past couple World Junior Championships, when in terms of skill and capabilities, he very much should have been not just on that roster, but in a top six capacity. That said, because AJ Spellacy plays the game the way he does, full of speed and physicality, very north-south style, and a style of play that you can just plug into your fourth line in that kind of tournament. And he's not only going to be reliable in that role, but he's going to wreak havoc offensively and also bring a really, really important boost of speed along the wing and kind of play that Josh Anderson role down the lineup for Team USA, which I could definitely see happening. But the big hurdle there, honestly, almost less than toolkit, because there's always like at least a dozen players that are good enough to crack a bottom line for a team with as much depth as Team USA always has. It's more that he's based in Canada, so we'll see how that develops. But the next question is another really interesting one based on the Blackhawks, and that has to do with Sacha Boisvert and John Mustard. So very much focusing on that 2024 draft class. What should Hawks fans be looking for in terms of growth through Boisvert's and Mustard's NCAA debut seasons, asks Marcus DeLong.
Yeah, so very interesting question. I think there's a lot to work with here regarding especially Boisvert and his progression in the NCAA. He's been playing for North Dakota, been really interesting for them so far. I've caught a couple of games of his, and there's so many different paths that his development could take. He could become a forechecking kind of forward. He can become a bit, he can lean into the goal scoring skill and just really become a sharpshooter at the next level. He could also expand on his playmaking skill or his two-way skill. Regardless of what happens, though, the growth is going to have to come in the skating side. And that usually we see a lot more of that during the offseason rather than throughout the regular season. Because during the offseason, prospects especially, have enough time allocated to focus on one specific thing. So I think year to year, my idea of progression with Boisvert is going to be to watch his first couple of games of the season every year and go, okay, where's his skating at? Because that's still the main hurdle in this game, right? Like he's not a fast player. He's not a player who can move really with agility. A lot of what he does is power. It's driving the net. It's using his frame, timing as well, using his frame to his advantage. All the things that usually lower skating players will need. But I think that as it's constructed right now, skating is a hurdle, and they'll need to come a couple steps. That's what I would really focus on in the offseason if I'm the Hawks with them. Those would be the objectives I would give them. Do you agree?
I do. And I mean, he's off to a hot start as well for the University of North Dakota. He has a goal and 4 points through his 3 first games in college hockey. He's been playing middle 6 minutes, so between 13 and 16 a night so far. So excellent production for a semi-depth role. And he's definitely going to be bumped up that lineup as the season progresses, I think, in all likelihood. So definitely a player that'll be interesting to keep an eye on. And honestly, I think like neither of us had many concerns about his leap to the NCAA level. Like our concerns have more to do with how he's going to be able to leverage his tools, and especially at speed against professional competition, and especially in the NHL, because this is a player that, in terms of profile, is a very high likelihood NHLer. It's more about to what extent, right? Is it going to be as a second line guy, as a third line guy, or a fourth line guy? I think any of those outcomes are definitely within the range of possibilities. But this is a player that's going to be very good in college hockey and is still going to have to just work on the skating, as you mentioned. But to move on to John Mustard, a player that is definitely more raw than Sacha Boisvert is, and is going to need more development time. He's one of the younger players from that draft class. It's an August 16th, 06 birthday, and he's yet to score a point through 3 games for Providence College in college hockey this year. But with his level of speed, with his curl and drag trademark wrister off the rush, I think he's going to get a decent amount of offense as the year progresses, and he kind of learns to pick his moments to leverage his speed and shooting ability in a depth role with Providence. But what are your expectations for Mustard this season? What would you like to see him really work on?
Very simple. It's one word. It's a big one, but it's diversification. I want to see more different ways to create offense, because Mustard was really set in his ways in the USHL last year. He was a player who did a couple of things really well with Waterloo, but I really want to see a bit more, using the cycle to his advantage, using his speed and transition, not just in terms of just bombing down the wing and just curling inside and shooting. I want to see more acceleration, deceleration, using kind of speed differentials to his advantage rather than just blowing past players. Because the NHL is all about creating scoring chances in 20 different ways. There's not one way to create offense in the NHL. There are multiple, and the more you're able to do offensively, the better you are. And it's not just about improving his playmaking, getting better at handling. He's good offensively. He's got the tools. It's just he needs to understand that there are different ways to create offense. And that might take a while in Providence. We're talking 3-4 years before he really nails that down. But I think at the end of the day, John Mustard is smart enough and capable enough to add those things to his toolkit and become a more versatile offensive threat. But that's our first segment done. We'll get into our second segment where we focus a bit more on Michael Hage, as well as one question about Lukas Reichel. We'll get into that in just a sec, but just before, a quick word from our sponsors at Game Time and Prize Picks. If you're looking to buy cheap tickets last minute to any event, Game Time is the best place to secure them. It's safe, it's secure, it's easy to use, and Game Time is incredibly useful when it comes to getting tickets last minute. And they're obsessed with saving you money. They've got deals at every step of the way, last minute deals, flash deals, zone deals, and they have the Game Time guarantee as well to make sure you get the best price for your tickets. Also, you can toggle all-in pricing in the app, and it'll show you exactly what you're paying for after fees, after taxes, so that you can make the best decision for your wallet. I use Game Time all the time when it comes to finding tickets last minute because my schedule moves around a ton, and it's really useful to be able to just figure out you've got an afternoon free, pull up Game Time, see what's going on in your area, and just buy a ticket. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, super simple. You just create an account and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. So download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed.
PrizePicks is the best way to get real money on sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, PrizePicks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just have to pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long on PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the only real money daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. So your lineups stay in play even if your players get injured midway through the season. If your player leaves in the first half and doesn't return, PrizePicks keeps your lineup live. Sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive your $50 bonus. It is guaranteed. PrizePicks also offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday. Each Tuesday, PrizePicks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide even more value to your lineups. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game.
Alrighty, so let's move on to our second segment here where we talk a bit more about some drafted prospects, and we'll start off with another Hawks question here. The question is from Matakumo on Twitter, who asks, what do you make of the development of Lukas Reichel? Now, this is an interesting one because with Lukas Reichel, it's been a weird progression, right? Like he started off as last year kind of playing next to Connor Bedard and looking really good, making some really good plays in transition, using his speed incredibly well in order to kind of open up speed differentials in transition and kind of open up space for Connor Bedard. Those two played really well together, and I saw them both developing a chemistry long term that would put Reichel in a really good position for his career. But so far, if I'm not wrong, he's back in the AHL, isn't he?
He's playing in the NHL. He has
Oh,
2
is he?
games this season, but he hasn't cracked 8 minutes and 32 seconds just yet. His 2 games were right around the 8.5-minute mark, so fourth line minutes when he's not being scratched. And I mean, as you mentioned, he had a really hot start as well in his rookie season in 22-23, where in 23 games he had 7 goals and 15 points. And then last year it went down to 16 points in 65 games. So only 1 more point in 40 more games. So it's definitely been a bit iffy in terms of the offensive progression. But as you mentioned, the skating's a clear area of strength with Reichel, and he's still a young player. I mean, this is a 22-year-old who was drafted 17th overall in 2020. There's definitely still runway for him to develop into, but I think especially with the players that Chicago has in their system, there are many other names I'm more confident in attaining like a real top 6 capacity long term, whether it be your Frank Nazars, your Oliver Moores, even your Nick Lardises, I think have a degree of offensive punch that is really, really impactful. But the nice thing is with Lukas Reichel, he thinks the game well, he skates the game even better, and that combination will make him a solid bottom 6 piece as a baseline, and hopefully he can rediscover the offensive punch that he's shown in flashes even at the NHL level.
Yeah, for sure. He's going to be an interesting player to keep tabs on. I think it's really interesting when you look back as well on the conversation in that draft year between Lukas Reichel and JJ Peterka, two Germans out of the Deutsche Elite League, who looked really good in their draft years there. Peterka's been, for me so far, I mean, pretty obviously by far the better player of the two early on, but I think that was expected. And the question is, what does Lukas Reichel turn into? I think Reichel's upside is still a tad higher than what Peterka is right now, whereas Peterka is kind of going to pretty much even out at what he is right now. So it's going to be an interesting conversation to keep tabs on. But we also need to talk about a couple questions about Michael Hage that we received. So first and foremost from Brian, has Michael Hage's stock gone up since the start of the NCAA season, or did you expect this look in production? I wrote about it over at Elite Prospects and for Habs Eyes on the Prize about Michael Hage. It's been a hot topic lately. I think he headed into the season with no one really knowing what was going to happen. No one knew if he's going to be playing top 6 minutes and thriving, if he's going to be a true top liner for Michigan, or if he'd have to work his way up to it, struggle. There were a lot of different pathways that Hage's progression could have taken, but so far in the NCAA, he's been absolutely money. And I think that anyone looking back at this, and it's so far in, earlier on post draft here, would be looking at Michael Hage at 21 going, that's low. Would you agree?
Yeah. Oh, totally. And I mean, Michael Hage leads the University of Michigan in points. He has 7, including 4 goals through 6 games this season. And he's been playing top line minutes. Like he's been playing 17, 18, 19 minutes a night. And his first game of the year, he only played 14. So from day one, he's been working his way up the lineup. And he's been lights out fantastic. I think like I'm not shocked by any means. Michael Hage is a player that I really took a liking to, especially in the back half of last season, and a player that I had really high hopes for, even heading into draft day, and even more so after he was selected by Montreal specifically, because I think, of course, there's like the entire emotional component of him being drafted by his hometown team that he'd been cheering for since childhood, alongside his father, who passed away unfortunately. But beyond just that, it's also a development system that I think is really like attuned to players like Michael Hage, who have fantastic degree of tools, but it's more about how to leverage them, how to access the middle, and how to just keep the pace up. That was the big thing with Michael Hage at the beginning of his draft year season, was just low pace, high event hockey that was very frustrating for coaches to watch specifically. And that's been definitely taking some big steps this year. So I definitely think that it's been a great start to the year for Michael Hage. Not something I'm shocked to see, but something that is very, very nice to see nonetheless. And the second Michael Hage themed question comes to us from George Russell Jr. Over on Twitter. And he asks, wondering if you guys think that Michael Hage will make Team Canada's World Junior Championship team this year. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, knowing Team Canada, they're not very big fans of non-CHLers going to the World Juniors, except for some extenuous circumstances, like someone like Macklin Celebrini, right? Or Adam Fantilli. But overall, unless you're an absolute superstar, most of the time they'll lean more towards CHL talent, and I don't blame him. I mean, especially with the amount of talent they have this year. Liam Greentree is going to be a returnee who's absolutely just lighting up the OHL, as we spoke about last episode. But on top of that, you have Gavin McKenna, Porter Martone, Michael Misa. You've got a lot of options in terms
Roger
of tops.
McQueen, if you want.
Roger McQueen as well. There's a lot of options. TJ Ginla, like there's a ton of guys that they can go with. Caden Lindstrom if he's back.
Brooke Catton.
Yeah, the list goes on and on and on and on, right? So the issue is, do they want Michael Hage in a bottom six role? Because that's likely where he would be playing if he goes to Team Canada, or like we discussed earlier with Nick Lardis, will they prefer someone who plays a more physical, more north-south game? Because as much as Michael Hage is 6'1", 190 pounds, he doesn't use it all that well. He's not a physical player by any means. So it's a matter of figuring out, what route they go. I wouldn't be surprised if they bring him as a 13th forward, but at the same time, I'm not expecting anything from Canada there. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think it wouldn't be my expectation for them to bring him. But that said, I think that even on just skill alone, he is among the 12 best players eligible for that forward group. And if you're able to bring him as your 13th forward, or just have him in a third line capacity, because he can play down the middle or on the wing, and that versatility as a transition driver is something that could also really help elevate his line mates. But we'll see what Hockey Canada does. I think they're a little bit more erratic than USA hockey is in terms of like whether they bring players playing north or south of the border, right? Like Hockey USA just doesn't bring players playing in the CHL, whereas at the very least, Canada can kind of dip into that USA pool. But yeah, we will see. I'd love to see him in a Canadian jersey, but it's never really a guarantee. But that closes off this second segment. In the next one, we're going to wrap up with some questions about various drafted players, ranging from Mavrik Bourque to Luca Munzenberger and Ilya Protas, and even Ivan Miroshnichenko. But first, a quick word from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season off big with a massive return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page where you place your bets. And you can take those swings on whatever sports pique your interest, whether it be American football with the NFL, or maybe European football. I mean, it's Champions League match day number 2 today, and there's a lot to look forward to on that side of things. Or maybe you're like into tennis or golf or whatever other sports you might enjoy. I mean, hockey's probably pretty high up your list if you're listening to this podcast. Whatever kind of sports fan you are, FanDuel has something to interest you. You'll get You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That is at FanDuel.com.
Alrighty, so let's close things off here with our final segment and talk about some more drafted prospects from across the league. And we'll start off with Edmonton. Dry Enjoyer on Twitter asks, thoughts on Luca Munzenberger? I'm going to be honest, I don't have many thoughts on Luca Munzenberger. He's a 21-year-old defenseman drafted in the 3rd round in the 2021 NHL draft. He's been playing with the University of Vermont in the NCAA, which isn't the best program, and he hasn't been doing good in not the best program, right? So there isn't really much to work with here in terms of immediate thoughts. He's a big, mobile defenseman. He played really well at the World Juniors in his draft year as an 18-year-old. I think that's really what kind of sold Edmonton on him, but this is why you take these small samples with a grain of salt. I know he was 18-year-old playing on a U20 team, national team against some top opposition, but sometimes just hit a good run. I didn't see anything else from Luca Munzenberger that indicates that he's going to be worth much at the next level. He's got 5 points, and he had 5 points in 35 games last year, and he's pointless so far through 5 games this year. It's not really much to write home about in that sense. He's going to be a defensive defenseman if he makes it. I don't think he makes it. I think at this stage of his career, unless he's a really late bloomer, I'd be surprised if we see anything kind of major from Munzenberger. Do you agree?
I do. I mean, he just logged his 12th career NCAA point, and this is his final season eligible for college hockey. I think that obviously the offensive limitations are there, and he was never drafted to be an offensive defenseman. But even on the defensive side of things, he takes a lot of minor penalties, and is pretty physical and a good skater, but that's kind of, I think, where he tops out. This is the kind of player that could be a solid depth AHL defenseman when he tops out, or a really good defenseman in the DEL over in Germany. But I think that the NHL expectations shouldn't be overly high. He's also a left shot defenseman, so he's had a lot more competition than if he were a righty. I think there's a lot of elements playing against his chances here, but I really liked his draft year tournament as well at the World Juniors, but since then it has not quite been at the same level. Next up, we have a question about one of my favorite prospects from his draft class, and it is about Mavrik Bourque. Demidov Fancam on Twitter asks, is Mavrik Bourque the real deal? I would argue yes. I've always been a really big fan of Mav Bourque. Really intelligent, offensively gifted centerman with good defensive habits, good defensive intelligence, head on a swivel, constantly scanning the ice, good mental map of teammates and opposition alike, and an absolute cannon of a shot on top of that. He's versatile. He can make an impact in all three zones. He is a 22-year-old who's just gotten into his fourth NHL game. He's played he's played 3 games with Dallas this season in a bottom six capacity, playing between 10 and 12 minutes a night. Hasn't scored an NHL point yet, but last season he was lights out for the Texas Stars in the AHL, where he was already an assistant captain, and he scored 26 goals and 77 points in 71 games, which is just great. Obviously had his partner in crime there for half a year as well with Logan Stankoven before he made the permanent leap to Dallas. And I don't think it's going to take Mavrik Bourque too long to establish himself as a day in, day out NHLer. Would you agree with that?
I have a bit more reservations about his progression so far and how much he's got runway in order to kind of hit the ground running with Dallas. I think there's some limitations to his game. Not necessarily a highly physical player, not necessarily a player who handles board battles that well, even though he's 5'10" and 192 pounds, so built like a tree stump. Yeah. There's still some kind of, I have my reservations. I think that Bourque at the end of the day is probably going to be looking like a third line offensive producer more than a top 6 player. But we'll see how that develops on that end. But to close things off here, we have a question from McBikey24 about a couple of Washington Capitals prospects. So his question is, what do you think about Ilya Protas and his dominant start to his OHL career, and Ivan Miroshnichenko, who started the season on fire, having 5 goals and 2 assists in his first 5 AHL games as a 20-year-old? And the other part of that question is, what would you say is their ceiling as NHL players? So I think we can start with Ilya Protas. He's a player that I caught kind of later on last year, around March, April, is when he started kind of popping up on my radar, and I started watching him a bit more, and I kind of like what I see. I understand the Capitals going for him. His brother's in their system, right? Like there's something to work with there, and they want to keep it in the family. But overall, he just, there's some limitation to his game. I like the fact that he's playing the OHL now. I like the fact that he's, kind of making a run for it, away from the USHL, because in the USHL, I didn't really like most of his tape. And granted, haven't watched much of him since the start of the year. I've been focused on draft eligibles, but overall, it's really interesting when a player goes from one league to another and doesn't miss a beat. We've seen it often. Guys go from the USHL, which is a lower end league, to the OHL, which is one of the best junior leagues in Canada, and their game kind of starts falling apart. They can't keep up. But Protas has been pretty good this season, right?
He's been excellent. I mean, through 7 games with the Windsor Spitfires, he's scored 8 goals and 13 points. Finally, Liam Greentree has an offensive partner in crime in that lineup, and those two have been really solid together. I've caught a couple viewings in passing where their chemistry has really stood out to me. I like Ilya Protas, I think maybe a little bit more than you do. I think he's a really capable net front presence. I like his playmaking in tight, and especially how he's been able to combine with a high IQ player like Liam Greentree. I also think bodes well. He's a type of guy that is able to raise his level of play alongside players that think the game at a high level, which is something that you really want to see out of players in this mold. Is he going to project as a top 6, even top 9 NHLer? Not fully sure, but in a bottom 6 capacity, adding some physicality as a 6'4", 196-pound left winger. I think that there's something to work with. But let's round this out here with the Ivan Miroshnichenko discussion, because as mentioned, he has 5 goals and 7 points through 5 games this season with the Hershey Bears in the AHL, following a really good campaign last year as well with Hershey, where he scored 9 goals and 25 points in his North American debut. So what are your thoughts on that start to the season and also his NHL projection in a broader scope?
Well, I mean, Miroshnichenko is Miroshnichenko. He's always been skillful, dynamic, intense. But I like the defensive improvements in his game that have come over the years. He's not a liability anymore. He's able to get back in his own zone, make plays, use that intensity, not just offensively, but defensively as well. That's kind of been the big progression for me with Miroshnichenko. I still think that with Miroshnichenko, we're talking about a prospect who, more likely than not, will be playing full-time NHL minutes next year. And will be placed in a position where he's going to be able to succeed. He's got great role models in Washington, and a good path forward to a top 6 role. I think that that's what you end up having in Miroshnichenko at the end of the day: a goal scoring, playmaking, high energy, top 6 forward who can bring a bit of everything. More likely for me, though, is a second liner. I don't see him kind of becoming a top line driving force on the Caps, but he'll be a very good complementary second line forward. It's going to be pretty good for his game.
Yeah, and especially also being able to kind of play a somewhat similar role to Ryan Leonard, and then you have that 1-2 punch on your first and second line long term.
Absolutely, fully agree. But that wraps things up for today's episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, remember to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments what you think of the episode. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please leave us a rate and review and make sure to make us your first listen of the day. If you're a second listen of the day, remember to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all your news and updates about what's going on around sports. And make sure to tune in for our next shows as we finish up our October coverage. This has been Hadi Kalikesh with Sebastian High, and we hope you tune in next time.